2, 3, 4. Let me tell you about PuckPedia, stats, contracts, and caps. It's all there for you. One-stop shop for your hockey information. It's a hockey sensation. So log on, log on, log on. If you give a puck, go to PuckPedia.com.
Welcome to episode 17 of the PuckPedia Hockey Show. Today we welcome on a very special guest. It's former assistant general manager of the Florida Panthers, Steve Werier. Steve gives us some great insight on what his time was like in the front office of the Florida Panthers around 2014 to 2017. He tells us a great story about how Nikita Kucherov was potentially an offer sheet candidate for the Florida Panthers and how that could have changed the trajectory of the Lightning and the Panthers organization. So we get a firsthand look on how the Florida Panthers front office approached that situation. Then we talk about Steve's current view on the game. A student of the CBA, he gives us his insight on some of the new rules in the CBA this year, such as the no double retention, as well as the playoff salary cap. Then Steve tells us a little bit about some of these teams that are teetering towards a rebuild, or some teams like the Sharks and the Ducks and the Blackhawks who have had successful rebuilds who now look prime for the future. We had a great conversation with Steve, and we're excited to hear what he has to say. So without further ado, let's drop the puck. We now welcome on a very special guest to the PuckPedia Hockey Show. It's former assistant general manager of the Florida Panthers, Steve Werier. Steve, how's it going today?
It's great, Keith. Thanks for having me on.
No, thanks for coming on. It's been a long time coming. Me and Steve have been playing some crazy phone tag, I'd say, over the last month, trying to lock this one down. But very interested to kind of hear Steve's perspective on currently what's going on in the NHL and kind of talk about his past with the Florida Panthers. He also does a lot of media hits. I've seen him on the PDO cast with Dimitri Filipovich for Sportsnet. He does some stuff over TSN as well, and he writes articles also on PuckPedia's website, breaking down some trades and trade deadlines. And there was a great article on the Sharks as well. So happy to kind of hear your take on all those things, Steve. But let's start off just talking about kind of how you started in hockey and, at a young age, like maybe were you always interested in kind of working your way up through a front office and how that eventually landed to working for the Florida Panthers?
Yeah, for sure. I think the beginning story is not dissimilar to most. Grew up in Canada, big sports fan, big hockey fan, played a bunch of sports, and my path to working in the NHL sort of came through the legal route, obviously, like more than a few assistant GMs. I went to law school in Toronto, and then I worked at a large New York corporate law firm for my first few years, and did some sports-related work on the side. Read up on the CBA and other sort of hockey-related things to keep current. And then just so happened was able to sort of make the right connections at the right time to get linked up, through some partners at my prior firm and a few other ways with the two partners who were buying the Panthers back in, I think, mid-2013-ish. So got involved with them along with a couple other folks and, really joined from the ground floor, at least with this iteration of the team. Sort of worked in all areas of the team, but a lot of hockey ops work behind the scenes the first few years. And then Eric Joyce and myself both joined formally as assistant GMs sort of midway through our time there. So overall was there for like 5 or 6 years, doing a bunch of hockey ops work, again, sort of behind the scenes and then in front of things as well. And really neat experience, obviously, like negotiating contracts, evaluating players, getting to be around the team and getting to know everyone around the league.
What were some of your favorite parts, or what was the favorite part of that job? Like you mentioned, you had a bunch of different things you were doing behind the scenes, and hockey ops is a very vague term. So, I mean, there's obviously the amateur side, the pro side, scouting, there's contract negotiations, there's, running the AHL team. So I'm interested, what was kind of your favorite part of that role?
Favorite part? It was neat, sort of like from an organizational standpoint, whether it's hockey or anything else. And I've been fortunate to work at some neat companies like Amazon and others sort of before and after hockey. It's always neat when you have the ability to build out a group. And so, one of those things you look back sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line and sort of anything you do, whether it's working for a hockey team or anywhere else, you're going to remember those personal relationships. So, favorite thing is I was lucky enough at that time to sort of have the authority and the ability to bring in some really interesting people to come into the organization, especially on the hockey ops side, who maybe it was their first time working in hockey and maybe they came from non-traditional backgrounds, and putting that group together, seeing them work together, achieving some really interesting wins and successes, doing things in a way that in many respects they hadn't been done before, especially at that time. I think looking back, those were sort of the things that stay with you, in addition to the fun and excitement of doing deals and making trades and sort of building out contracts and a cap profile and negotiating with agents and handling the media and all that fun stuff that you don't really know what it's like until you're on the inside. Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up the fun stuff, and there is one story I did want to ask you about, and it involves Nikita Kucherov, who's objectively one of the best players currently in the NHL. I was reading up, and essentially there was a world where the Florida Panthers were mulling over an offer sheet for Kucherov when he was coming off his entry-level deal. So walk us through that, because if that were to take place and the Tampa Bay Lightning ended up not matching it, it could completely have changed the complexion of the NHL over the last decade.
Yeah, so that was a fun one. You said the stakes pretty accurately. Kucherov, was a restricted free agent. He was offer sheet eligible. We were pretty confident, like everyone else, that he was a player worth going after, and to sort of stick it to the in-state rival, who at the time had some, from the outside at least, some pretty significant cap issues to deal with. It was a perfect storm, so to speak. And yeah, I mean, the story's true. Sort of spent the late summer into the early fall, getting internal buy-in, making the pitch, structuring the potential offer sheet in a way that would make it the most effective. Which, keep me honest here, but I think way back then, I think it was about 7.14 was the AAV, above which it was a first, second, and third round pick as comp, and maybe above that it was 4 firsts. So we were in the range of thinking, if we made an offer sheet, issued one to Nikita in that range, in the mid sevens, that might force Tampa's hand. Our owners at the time were very clear, like, this wasn't make an offer sheet to make Tampa bite a poison pill and keep them and mess up their cap, which would be fun, and I probably would have been down with that even if that was the end game. But that wasn't it. It was very much, listen, we're only going to do this. We're only going to put the spotlight on ourselves, if and only if we have a realistic shot at getting this player. So we did a lot of diligence on it. One thing that I spent a lot of that summer on as the assistant GM responsible for contracts was making sure we position ourselves to be as less vulnerable as possible in the event we went that route. And so what does that mean? It meant we were proactive. I went out, signed Jonathan Huberdeau early in the summer, Sasha Barkov sort of the year before, to a 6-year deal each. We negotiated with Aaron Ekblad sort of around the draft to lock him up to a long-term deal as well. And the mindset there was, listen, if we get Kucherov, we don't want someone coming to poach our own players. So let's make sure we, lock up our best young assets to long-term deals, so that there's not really anything anyone can do to the extent they want to seek retribution. And we've already signed those players and preserved enough cap space to go after Nikita. So we did that groundwork. I got all those deals done, and ultimately it went all the way into the preseason. I remember Eric and I and a few of our folks were sitting at a restaurant in Tampa right across the rink before a preseason game of the Lightning, thinking, someone made a joke saying, hey, did we go tell, the fans sitting over there, we're about to go offer sheet your superstar and make him a Panther in a day or two. Didn't get that far. End of the day, we weren't 100% certain that we could get the player if we sent the offer sheet, and we gave Tampa, that 7-day window to sort of maneuver as they probably would have, to the greatest of their abilities, to make the space to sign a player who they obviously liked. They were just slow playing it to get the best deal they could, and they ended up actually signing him, I think, for what was it? I think the mid fours on a bridge at the time. So it ended up okay. He didn't end up being a Panther. It turned out okay for both clubs, who went on to great successes and more Stanley Cups. But it was a fun few months.
So for you guys, from your perspective, the only way you were going to actually put forward the offer sheet was if you were 100% convinced that the Lightning were not going to match it. And if you had any kind of thought that they might match it, you thought it wasn't worth it to kind of put that spotlight on the Panthers organization.
Yeah, that's right. That was our analysis. And obviously you have to have good intel. So, like, I spent some time meeting with Nikita's agents up in New York just to get some rough sense, what would a hypothetical offer sheet to anyone, no names, look like at the time, and other folks sort of thought, what would be the right range where we thought maybe he would sign. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But yeah, end of the day, it was, organizational call of, hey, this may not work, and we don't want, maybe we'll holster that one for a better chance, and moved on to other players and whatever.
Yeah, it worked out for both sides, like you mentioned. Tampa won a couple Stanley Cups, in the late 2010s, and then Florida, obviously, back-to-back reigning Stanley Cup champions. So both teams having a lot of success lately, and I think it's interesting too, like you mentioned, like having to talk to the agent at some point too, because on the one side, like the agent's always working in the best interest of their clients and trying to get the best deal for them. So sometimes they could be serious with when they're talking to another organization about maybe a potential offer sheet, or other times they could be totally posturing to then go back to their original team to kind of get the most amount of money from them. And it's your job as like the assistant general manager to kind of snuff out what's real and what's fake.
Yeah, that's totally right, and that's something you always have to be front of mind. If you're an agent, sort of have a dual role there. Number one is you want to maximize you want to maximize your players' interest and what they've told you they want to do, and sometimes that's get the biggest contract on the market. Sometimes it's get the most money from the team I'm on, and sometimes it's neither of those things. But as a club negotiating with an agent, certainly you got to always be aware of. I wouldn't say you're being played, so to speak, because it really is a repeat interaction game, and to the extent this is an agent with multiple clients, or a number of ways it could line up, you don't necessarily want to burn bridges for one deal. So it's not so much as like, hey, are they pulling one over our heads, but you might not get a straight answer, and like things change every day. So you ultimately just have to say, even if our external info is incorrect, are we still taking an action that's in our best interest and makes sense? And if those other things line up perfectly, then bonus. But yeah, you're dead on that being something you got to think about.
And as Elliot Friedman says every single day, he says one phone call can change everything. So, you take all the information you have at the current moment, but there's one phone call that could totally shift gears on how, players, teams, agents are thinking about the situations. And I think it's interesting too, like dealing with all the back room stuff and all those negotiations that go on. Let's take a break in the action from the interview to talk about iTix Now. iTix Now is a ticket marketplace built specifically for hockey fans. They have zero fees for buyers and sellers, unlike most competitors. Fans can buy parking, single game tickets, and last minute ticket deals. If you visit itixnow.com, you get a great deal on your tickets. Real fans, real sellers, no fees. Now let's get back to the interview. Steve, why don't we fast forward a little bit now to the current state of the game? So we're end of November here, 25-26 season. I want to talk to you first on some of the changes in the CBA and how you think that's going to impact kind of the rest of the regular season moving forward at this point in the season, but also as we approach the trade deadline. So some of the big changes in the CBA is one, the playoff salary cap this year, which has been different than other years. So you are no longer able to exceed the salary cap by as much as you want in the playoffs. There's going to be a cap. There's certain rules on it. It's just the players that are dressed. But that also impacts how LTIR and season-ending LTIR are calculated during the season. You only get $3.82 million of benefit if you don't designate a player season-ending LTIR. And then there's also no more double salary retention on trades. So a lot of teams that were tight on cap space were using a third team to broker a deal on a double retention, and that team that had ample cap space that was willing to eat some of that would usually get draft pick compensation in return, a mid-round pick, somewhere between a third to a fifth round pick. So we won't be seeing a lot of those deals at the trade deadline. So I'm curious how you think that all is going to impact the next few months as we gear up towards the playoffs in April.
Yeah, good question. I mean, from like the PA perspective, I don't love the double retention change, and like sort of have your table set here, and like there's massive money obviously coming into the game. The PA and the league, in both of their interests, especially the PA, to avoid a work stoppage or a lockout or anything like that. Like the league and revenue and player salaries are on such an upward trajectory. These are all much smaller issues than saying like, hey, how could you not sort of have this as a no-go. Putting that aside, like I don't love double retention being sort of limited, because I think more money and more liquidity and more creativity is both, good for players, good for agents, good for the game, also good for fans. Like more chaos is always better, especially in this day and age. Again, not a massive thing. It's not like there's 20 players a week being swapped in double retention deals, and we're also heading towards more of an era where like there's going to be a big disconnect between the high end players who are being signed to these very big long-term deals, lots of trade protection, lots of move protection, and sort of like the lesser tier players comp wise, and that still may hold true as more money comes in and the cap goes up. It may just be sort of strong link theory that the more marquee players are taking a bigger piece of the pie as opposed to like it's a bigger pie, we all get bigger slices. Like that's not how it works in the NHL. It's not how it works at Thanksgiving dinner. It's sort of an abstract thought. So like I don't love the double retention being less common. I think there's some players, especially like veteran guys, where it would help to make it as easy as possible to sort of find a broker, flip them. That said, there may be fewer teams this year looking at the standings who are sort of out of it and selling early. So don't love that one. In terms of the cap, same sort of mental model of artificially creating more flexibility is good for the game. Let teams load up. Let a club maybe who hasn't had a shot at the playoffs for a long time, who's going for it, have a better chance to, within reason, make moves. But on the other hand, you don't want the perception that games are being won on spreadsheets, even if it's a spreadsheet being run by someone in Russia eating cashews, whatever. So I'm empathetic to both sides of
that's an Adam Foote reference, by the way, for people who didn't pick that one up.
Yeah, and sidebar, I'm totally fine with what Adam Foote said. I think if you're an NHL coach, you should absolutely have the mindset of like, I'm able to make better decisions than simply public-facing data. You should think you have a competitive advantage, and if not, you're in the wrong role. So no issue with Adam Foote's comments. Getting back to LTI and all that, yeah, like I get it. You don't want to create the perception of impropriety, and rightly or wrongly, that sort of crept in with some of the stuff Vegas and other clubs have done, leveraging the rules to the full extent. So I think the change is good. I don't think you want to go down that road of just fans thinking like, oh no, here we go again. I don't think overall it has like a massive impact, except at the margins and in those use cases where you have, here's a player who's out for a while. Let's sort of game it until April. But there's sort of that saying I've seen that like coaches will find every way to make 3-on-3 boring or take the excitement out of the game. Like assistant GMs and managers will find every way to find the tiniest loophole in rule changes like this. So there's going to be a few things that pop up where you're going to say, oh, like I don't think anyone saw that coming, and I don't think that was the intent of making these changes. And it'll be fun to see what those are and when they come up.
Yeah, the 3-on-3 is interesting because to your point, like I definitely think when it first started, it was electric and you were kind of seeing teams really go for it. And now you've gotten to a point where it's a 100% like possession game where they've kind of diluted the excitement out of it by just, regrouping. And I think there could be rules in place to make it more exciting, but to what extent the NHL is willing to go forward with that, we shall see in the future. Another thing you brought up that I think is interesting that I want to talk about a little bit is trade protection. So me and Hart were talking about this on Cap Central on Thursday, where 36% of the current NHL roster players have some sort of trade protection. When you account for players who are actually eligible for trade protection, so players who are not in their RFA years but are in their UFA years, it's all the way upwards of 62% of players have trade protection that are eligible. So as someone who's an assistant general manager who was part of these negotiations, where do you think it kind of shifted to where so many of these players are now needing some sort of trade protection in their contracts? And I did a full analysis of like which kind of players are getting these protection. And aside from the star players, there's middle of the lineup players. There's a couple players who are buried in the minors now currently that have trade protection. So it's just gotten to a point where I feel like it's too much. The players have kind of shifted the power there and they have too much leverage in these negotiations.
Yeah, I haven't seen your list. I'd be interesting to see it. That's indeed a little project to game. I wonder, and this might be too inside baseball and grasping at straws, but like there's been a consolidation among major agencies. So there's more players at the same handful of agencies. And like anything else, there's a copycat game. So to the extent you have more players who are with, agents who have a record of getting deals like that, or think they have leverage with GMs for deals like that. Every discussion between a GM and an agent is often like, well, what about the last deal we did where you said this or you said that? And there's ways to differentiate all the time. But to the extent it's, an agent who's got those deal terms representing a player in a similar spot to a prior client, that might help. Sitting where I sat as an, AGM, as a team, you obviously want fewer trade protections than more. And like the consequences of those things are so much bigger than you think they would be at the time. But it also goes back to mindset. GMs who are thinking long term will be less inclined to give those kind of protections to anyone. And GMs who think they have less job security might be more inclined to give that type of protection simply because, like, there's a lawyer I worked with long ago who used the phrase IBG, YBG, which means I'll be gone, you'll be gone. And unless you think, hey, I'll be there in this role in years 6 and 7 and 8 of that deal, then the no move and no trade protections at the end become less relevant to you. And I know, like, looking back, from my own perspective, like, did a 6-year deal with Alan Walsh for Jonathan Huberdeau. And one of the main sticking points back then for me was, we want to make sure, at least in the final year of the deal, that the player, if there's any, unexpected reason we might need to move them, that our hands aren't completely tied. And obviously that trade protection, didn't work to my benefit. I wasn't there in year 6, but it certainly helped the club in terms of monetizing an asset in the final year, solely by virtue of the flexibility you had in the last year of the contract on a deal you signed, 7 years prior. So, I think a little bit of all of that comes into play. Interesting to see, like, how that trend continues or doesn't continue with the rising dollars, and whether teams are successfully able to trade off, a few more dollars for a little bit less on the trade protection front. But yeah, interesting to see sort of how you studied that and maybe how that evolves with the changing cap. It's certainly a certainly a function of cap constraints, right? Like, the less dollars you have, the more you have to be creative to the extent there's demand for players. And when that happens, you might trade off, trade protection for a lack of cap space.
Yeah, now with the rising cap, right, there's going to be more teams flush with cap space, and what was once viewed as like a real commodity is now maybe a little more open to other teams. And then I think your point too is interesting, where general managers who don't feel like they're going to be there for the long term are doing a lot of moves that are kind of short term benefit, but may hinder the team long term. And as a fan, you don't want to see that, but you understand where they're coming from. And then there's also the business side of things too. When if teams really strip it down to the studs and do a full rebuild, they're going to see the impact of that on ticket sales, merchandise, like everything else. So owners aren't necessarily fully on board with them kind of doing a full rebuild. And let's kind of take a look at like some of the teams this year, for example. You look at teams that really stripped it down, who are having success this year, like the San Jose Sharks are doing a really good job this season, and they look like they have a strong core for the future. Same with the Anaheim Ducks and also with the Chicago Blackhawks. Then you look at some teams who are kind of in a not as good spot. You look at the Calgary Flames, for example, St. Louis Blues, Nashville Predators, or a couple teams that have a lot of heavy veteran contracts and not as much in the excitement of youth talent. So I think, and the Vancouver Canucks are one today where the GM posted a memo that basically the entire team's open for business, maybe minus Quinn Hughes. And so we'll see how that all plays out. But what are your thoughts on some of these, maybe the younger teams who are having success in the rebuild versus some of these older teams that are more middling right now and kind of have a decision to make of whether they strip it down or whether they try to do a retool on the fly? That seemed to work well in Washington the last couple of years.
Yeah, it has worked well in Washington. I think Washington has the advantage of having a group in place who achieved success prior to the retool, and you can hang your head on that, especially when it's in the same market. I'm a big fan of what Mike Greer and his group have done in San Jose. I think culturally they've done really well in terms of bringing in progressive-minded coach and bringing in some veteran players like Toffoli, who are just really good cultural leaders, but also good hockey players. And that's important for bringing up guys like Celebrini and Smith, and obviously acquiring a guy like Askarov, just a great deal in terms of acquiring a high-end asset for minimal cost, in a foundational position where you don't have someone to begin with. So obviously they're moving faster than a lot would have expected this year, or many would have expected, and the same goes for Chicago. I think Chicago, maybe a bit of a more circuitous route from the outside in terms of a few moves for veterans and a few contracts and deals that maybe didn't, at the time they were made, sort of jump out as, hey, that is a great move for a rebuilding club and the best move they could have made at the time. But they're certainly in a great spot right now, and Kyle Davidson deserves a lot of credit for that with where they are, in terms of surrounding Bedard with the right kind of players and being a competitive team faster than most would have, expected. And yeah, flipping it around in Anaheim as well. Anaheim's obviously having a great season and put themselves in a good spot. When you're in a spot like Vancouver, where you haven't yet, at least publicly made that decision to go one way or another, it's tough because everyone's, management's in limbo, players are in limbo, coaches in a tough spot. I think usually it's beneficial to start a rebuild a little too early than wait until a little too late. And Vancouver, probably is sort of on the precipice of it being one or the other. But they have some very desirable assets that they can flip and monetize and asset harvest and position themselves really well for the draft. And then it's just a decision like anything else of, every year you sort of have to sit and say, hey, who's the management team we have? What's the staff we have? And is this the right team for what we want to do as of today and what we want to do for the next, 5-10 years? Good leaders usually think long term, and that's not easy in a game where every hour, if you want to, you can be, scrolling social media or whatever and getting an instantaneous take. But that's what you need if you're embarking on something like that, saying, hey, we're starting a rebuild now. Like, that's a long road. And San Jose's lucky. San Jose and Chicago each have, absolute generational talents, which again is not a guarantee of, future success in any way. But, you're talking about potentially 7-9 years, of a good rebuild, putting you in a, long-term, really good spot. And that needs a certain mindset. And, those are tough decisions for presidents and owners. And, they sort of determine everything else.
Exactly. And then on the flip side to that too, with how close the NHL standings are this year, and at the beginning of the season, Pittsburgh was the quote unquote only real team that was selling, and now they're at a point where they're hovering on a wild card spot, and it's hard to imagine a world where they completely strip it to the studs unless they fall off dramatically in the next, month or so. But and then some of these other teams who maybe haven't decided that they're necessarily rebuilding, so they don't have as many sellers. And then teams you thought might be sellers like San Jose, Chicago, Anaheim are actually doing pretty well, and they might want to reward their younger players at that time. So, what do you make of like how that's going to impact sort of the trade deadline this year, where we might not see as much action in addition to the double retention, just because of how close these standings are? It seems a lot closer than other years, and how many teams are not really selling.
Yeah, I mean, I think we will see a lot of action. I think it just means a lot more teams will be motivated to do things one way or another. And maybe some of that's just player deals that make both teams better. Maybe it's a team swapping a pending RFA or UFA for a, equally talented player who they have a better shot at keeping. There's lots of sort of opportunities. And I think having management who are like more engaged and focused versus sort of in limbo of underperforming and being out of things is, better than the inverse. I think Pittsburgh's done that a little bit with Kyle, where he's, added some players to keep the team competitive, given, who he has there and the obligation to those players, while at the same time doing some good asset harvesting with that deal with, Vancouver and the Rangers. I think for Pittsburgh to end up with that first round pick is just like.
And Kindle looks great too.
Yeah, so just, sort of a magical piece of work right there to acquire a first, and I think only send out, what was it, Marcus Pettersson on a near expiring deal. Exact type of thing really any team should be doing, regardless of where you are in the standings. So, I think more teams will be motivated to do that. To your point, can't see Chicago or San Jose, regardless of where they are, really being sellers early. I think the experience for those players and the fans and everything else of where they are, do you really want to, substantially subtract from that excitement? Then again, they're not trading the big name guys, and everyone else is a bit of a step down, so they can probably make some deals and still be all right. And then it's been written and talked about by everyone and their brother, but obviously Vancouver will be sort of one to watch like they were last year, given who they have, where they are, and those Canadian teams under the microscope, Toronto as well, sort of become combustible and attention and self-fulfilling prophecies and all that. Once things get moving, it'll sort of maybe set the table for the rest of the league.
Yeah, that would be the most surprising thing, I think, if you tell me that we get to the trade deadline and Toronto ends up being one of the sellers because they're pretty far out of the playoff race. I don't think anyone predicted that when the season started, but I mean, here we are now where they're kind of sitting in the basement of the Eastern Conference, and they have a lot of injuries. They have time to make it up, but we'll see how that all plays out. Well, Steve, this has been great so far. Just one final question before we wrap up. It's our cool bet question. If you go to puckpedia.com/coolbet, you can get in on the action today. Stay cool cool and bet responsibly. Puckpedia.com/coolbet. So it's just a question that we ask kind of all our guests here. And it's just any advice you might have for someone who's interested in kind of making it into, a front office, similar to your background. Like you have the law degree that obviously kind of propelled you and helped set your kind of expectation. But maybe if someone doesn't necessarily have a law degree, like what advice you would have, or if someone does have a law degree and wants to get into hockey, like how would you approach it if you were in their position?
I think the best advice I could give to someone who's younger and maybe, if you're talking about someone in college or earlier in their career, is just do whatever you love the most and be as good as possible at it, regardless of what it is, as opposed to a career where you're saying, like, how much does this job translate to working for a pro sports team or an NHL team or, being an NHL assistant GM. I think, if you simply show the work ethic, and that you're passionate about what you're doing and that you're good at it, that's a translatable skill. I think people over-index on, like, how does this specific experience, regardless of what it is, sort of show I want to go work for a hockey team. People, when they're on the inside of running teams, are not surprised that applicants, regardless of their background, are like, I've always wanted to work in pro sports, because most people, or many people, do. So, like, that would be my first piece of advice, is sort of do what you love and don't fixate on whether what you're doing is directly relevant, because, if you're an engineer or you're whatever in the sciences or whatnot, like, you're overqualified for 99% of the jobs in professional sports. And it's just a matter of the right doors opening, and you'll have a skill set and the technical ability to do that job. So yeah, that's sort of the best advice. And if you want the easiest path, just be a really, really good hockey player, because there's a lot of ex-players in those roles. But that one didn't work.
Yeah, that's obviously the easiest path. Just become an NHL superstar and then hop right into management or coaching. But cool. No, Steve, thank you so much for the time. This was great. We really enjoyed having you. Anything else you want to plug before we kind of hop off here?
No, we're good. Thanks, Keith. That was a lot of fun.
PuckPedia.com.